I used to think I had the kind of life that people envy, quiet, stable, unremarkably happy. Our home sat on a peaceful street with flowering hedges and the kind of silence that only comes with safety. I'd been married to David for 22 years, a man who was never flashy, never loud, but steady. He worked in finance, loved routine, and rarely raised his voice. We weren't passionate in the way movies portrayed, but we were solid. At least, I thought we were. Our son, Ethan, was the light in my life. 20 years old, thoughtful, and sharp-minded, he still lived at home while attending university nearby. He had David's sense of discipline, but with a gentleness that was uniquely his. Growing up, we were close. He talked to me about everything from science projects to heartbreaks. I cherished those conversations like heirlooms. Evenings were quiet rituals. Dinner by 7, a movie if we had time, and the occasional board game when all three of us were feeling nostalgic. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt real, familiar, safe. But in hindsight, safety can be an illusion, a mask that hides fractures you've taught yourself not to see. About a year ago, subtle shifts began. David started working late more often. He brushed off my questions with vague mentions of deadlines or networking dinners. I trusted him. I had no reason not to. At first, Ethan didn't seem affected. But then he, too, began to change. He grew quiet at dinner, his eyes fixed on his plate. He'd disappear into his room after eating and lock the door behind him. I figured it was the stress of school or something personal he didn't want to share yet. I gave him space, like any good mother would. Still, the air felt different, thicker. The house, once filled with the small warmths of shared lives, began to feel hollow. I would catch Ethan glancing at David with an expression I couldn't name, part resentment, part sadness, and something else I couldn't place. David, in turn, avoided meeting Ethan's eyes at all. I mentioned it once, lightly, as we cleared the table. "Everything okay between you two?" I asked. David didn't pause. "He's just being a typical college kid. Probably outgrowing us." His tone was clipped, dismissive. I laughed it off, but it didn't sit right. Still, I told myself not to overthink it. Families change. People evolve. Maybe I was just being sensitive. But late at night, when the house fell still and I lay awake listening to the ticking of the clock, I felt something beneath the surface, something unspoken, something wrong. I didn't know it then, but the quiet life I had built so carefully was already beginning to crack. And I would soon discover that the fault line ran straight through the heart of my family. The unraveling came slowly, like thread slipping loose from a tightly woven seam. No grand discovery, no single moment of shock, just a series of subtle misalignments that built into a quiet, unbearable dread. It started with a scent. One evening, David came home late, jacket slung carelessly over his shoulder. I kissed him hello, and as I leaned in, I caught it, perfume. Soft, floral, unfamiliar. I hesitated, smiled through it. Maybe a coworker's perfume had transferred. Harmless, I told myself. Then came the locked devices. David had never been secretive with his phone before. But now it was password protected and always face down. He took it with him everywhere, even to the bathroom. When I asked casually, he shrugged. "Too many office emails," he said. Ethan's behavior was shifting in tandem. He was distant, yes, but also brittle. He flinched when touched, avoided eye contact, and seemed perpetually on edge. His phone never left his side either. He didn't smile as easily anymore. I watched the boy I'd raised pull away, slowly, like a tide receding from shore. One afternoon, while folding laundry in his room, I found a small, elegant receipt tucked between his textbooks. It was for a necklace, delicate, expensive, feminine. Purchased at a boutique across town. The name on the receipt wasn't mine. I held it in my hands for minutes, willing it to make sense. Maybe he had a girlfriend. That would explain the late nights and secrecy. But Ethan had always been open with me. He told me everything, or so I'd believed. Still, I clung to the idea of a harmless secret. Maybe he just wasn't ready to share. But then something else happened. I was in the kitchen cleaning when I overheard a conversation, Just a murmur through the thin hallway wall. David's voice, low and urgent. Ethan's, sharp and wounded. I couldn't make out the words, but the tension was unmistakable. It ended abruptly with a door slamming. When I stepped into the hallway, both of them were gone. I began noticing the looks. The way Ethan's eyes would darken when David entered the room. The way David avoided being alone with him, or how he left a room the moment Ethan entered. There was a thick discomfort between them, too raw to be coincidence. One evening, I followed a sudden impulse. David had left his work laptop unattended. I opened it. Emails appeared, clean and orderly, until I found a hidden folder labeled Personal. Inside were drafts of messages, never sent but carefully written. They were addressed to someone simply labeled E. Romantic, emotional, even poetic. My heart seized. E could be anyone, I thought. But I already knew. That night, I watched from the window as David picked Ethan up down the block, well away from our house. They exchanged something, I couldn't see what. But their interaction was quiet, loaded. Intimate, even in its silence. My breath caught. There are truths we're not ready to hold, even when they stand inches from our face. And in that moment, I realized I was holding one far too heavy to ignore. I confronted Ethan the next morning, nerves blazing like live wires. We sat at the edge of his bed, sunlight pouring across unmade sheets, dust motes drifting between us. I told him I loved him, that nothing he could confess would change that. My voice barely reached a whisper, yet it felt thunderous. His shoulders curled inward. Tears welled before words arrived. He said it started a year ago, after David drove him home from a late class. They stopped for coffee, talked about ambition, adulthood, loneliness. In the car outside our quiet house, David kissed him. Ethan froze, unsure whether to recoil or pretend it hadn't happened. David apologized, called it confusion, swore it would never repeat. But it did. Small intimacies multiplied. A hand on the knee, secret gifts, hushed messages drafted then deleted. David framed it as mentorship, something special they shared. Ethan, wrestling with his own identity and desperate for guidance, let the boundary blur. Shame settled over him like wet concrete. He didn't tell me because he feared destroying our family and doubted anyone would believe a son accusing his stepfather of desire. Listening, I felt my pulse hammer my temples. Betrayal pierced twice, once as wife, again as mother. I gathered Ethan into my arms, felt his sobs rattle through both of us. I promised he was not to blame, that love never demands secrecy, and adults should guard, not exploit, emerging hearts. My promise steadied him. Rage steadied me. I marched to David's office that afternoon. He sat behind a mahogany desk polished to a mirror, pretending composure. When I asked if he loved our son, he said of course. When I asked what kind of love hides in parked cars and encrypted threads, he stammered. Then, like a mask slipping, indifference surfaced in his eyes. He described temptation, called the moments harmless, claimed Ethan was curious. Every sentence dug a deeper grave for our marriage. I told him to leave our home immediately and to expect no silence from me. He tried to argue, to shift blame onto late-night workloads and my supposed emotional distance. I met every excuse with one truth. He had abused our trust and our child. Eventually, he packed a single suitcase, muttering about misunderstandings, and walked out into the evening drizzle. That night, I called a therapist specializing in trauma, determined that professional help would catch us before we collapsed completely. Hope quietly glimmered in the dark. When the door clicked shut, the house felt cavernous, walls echoing with things I never wanted to hear. Ethan stood at the top of the stairs, eyes red but resolute. I reached for him, and together we listened to the fading engine on the road, like a lid sealing the past. The fault line had broken open. Nothing lay intact. Yet in the shards I saw us, raw, wounded, still breathing. Survival, I realized, begins the moment truth stops hiding and tentative, fragile promises of tomorrow. The days that followed felt surreal, like walking through a life I no longer recognized. There were no angry shouting matches, no dramatic public scenes. Just silence. A house rearranging itself around the absence of a man who had hollowed out our trust. Ethan moved back into his childhood room fully for the first time in months. He kept the blinds drawn and the lights low. I gave him space, but never distance. Every morning I knocked gently, even if just to ask if he wanted tea or toast. Slowly, he began to answer. Therapy became a lifeline. At first, just for Ethan. Then one day, he asked if I'd join him. Sitting beside him on that couch, listening to the tremble in his voice as he retold what he had buried for so long, I wept. For him. For the years I believed we were safe. For the guilt I hadn't earned, but still carried like a stone in my chest. Recovery didn't follow a script. Some days, Ethan laughed like nothing had happened. Other days, he couldn't look me in the eye. I learned not to press. Healing, I realized, doesn't arrive in grand gestures. It sneaks in quietly, in the form of eye contact held for an extra second, or a shared joke over dinner. As for David, he never reached out. No calls. No messages. A part of me waited for an apology, a confession, even a final excuse. But none came. That, in its own way, was closure. Friends noticed his absence, of course. I offered them half-truths. He had an affair. We separated. That was all they needed to know. The real story, the one too complex, too cruel, too private, belonged to us. I took up journaling again. Every night, I wrote a single sentence about the day, sometimes hopeful, sometimes angry, but always honest. Ethan began to write too. Sometimes we read to each other. Sometimes we didn't need to. We built new routines. Sunday hikes in the woods. Cooking classes online. Even movie nights returned, though we now prefer dramas with quiet endings. There are still moments when the memory grips me like a fist. When I wonder if I missed signs I should have seen. But I've stopped blaming myself. I loved and trusted, and that is not a weakness. It's a strength that predators miscalculate. One evening, months after David left, Ethan sat beside me on the porch. The sky was dimming into gold, and the world felt still. He said, "You believed me. You stayed. That's what matters." I didn't respond with words. I just took his hand. Because this story isn't about what was broken. It's about what we chose to rebuild. He was the victim. I was the witness. But now, together, we are survivors. And that will always be enough.